I enjoy musical curiosities, oddities, some of which turn up in Devon Baroque concerts. In a sensible string serenade, suddenly a night watchman wanders in and starts to sing. A violin solo is accompanied by a violone with greaseproof paper threaded through the strings. A piece by C.P.E. Bach is accompanied by a narrative explaining how miserable the violinist feels compared to the happy harpsichordist. I think the explanation of my love of musical eccentricity is because I'm a composer first of all, with a nose for oddity of human behaviour and invention. Among the pillars of musical greatness that feature in Devon Baroque concerts are occasional weird moments, which maybe are encouraged by me. As I'm primarily a composer, at least that's how it still feels to me, I might be expected to choose something wacky and wild, at least from this century. But no, in the college where I've worked for years, I'm thought of as a Baroque specialist. A worrying thought with an undercurrent of expectations I can't deliver. Instead, call me an amateur of early music, or use the French word mélomane. It's their word for music lover. So I love music quite indiscriminately, and like any century, the 18th has its special delights, some of which are specially stimulating to a 21st century composer. As I'm intrigued by musical weirdness, it might be a surprise that I find this in J.S. Bach. In my teens, I had given myself the impression that Bach was a boring old codger who was good at writing fugues but had little sense of colour or excitement. I am ashamed to remember this when I was too preoccupied discovering the Rite of Spring and Pierrot Lunaire. Nevertheless, in time I grew up a bit, and I have discovered Bach to be as great a visionary as Berio or Ligeti, by which I mean his capacity to enlarge the boundaries of the permissible in the empire of sound, to borrow a phrase from Debussy. But unlike Stravinsky, of whom Debussy was speaking, Bach's Christian faith gave logic and limits to the way he could organize his music. And he summarized this by speaking of figured bass. So Bach says, "The figured bass is the most perfect foundation of music, being played with both hands in such a manner that the left hand plays the notes written down while the right adds consonances and dissonances, in order to make a well-sounding harmony to the glory of God. And the aim and final reason, as of all music, so of figured bass, should be none else but the glory of God and the recreation of the mind. Where this is not observed, there will be no real music, but only a devilish hubbub." So for Bach there were limits, and he could not have written something like this. This is Bieber's musical impression of a group of drunken soldiers in a tavern dating from about 1673. A deliberate evocation of chaos, an iconoclastic moment. And here Bieber leaps over the boundaries of the permissible, and everyone would have known that this was not real music, but yes, a devilish hubbub. Bach, as far as I know, never gave in to anything as wantonly destructive as that. but he would often be pushing against the limits of the acceptable grammar of his time to come up with the utterly extraordinary and visionary nonetheless. As a collection of weirdnesses, the Brandenburg concertos are hard to beat. They exhibit countless examples of the unusual, and it must have been a great disappointment to Bach to find that the Margrave of Brandenburg, to whom he dedicated the music, seems hardly to have found time to open the score, let alone to imagine Bach worthy of a position at his court. I'm going to look at a small corner of the first concerto because it's so fascinating and because it connects very much with my inclinations as a composer. It comes in the beautifully melancholy second movement, an adagio dominated by the plaintive sounds of three oboes who form a kind of antiphonal choir against the trio of upper strings. The second idea of this movement at bar 9 doesn't look too unusual on the face of it. In the first beat, the bass of this G minor music is stationary, while the oboes play G minor, dipping down to the dominant and back up again. But here the weirdness begins. The bass proves to be the melody which began the movement, where it was supported by a dominant major chord. But now the same melody is accompanied by this minor key music from the oboes, resulting in a narrow miss between the A flat in the bass and the A natural in the third oboe. So there's a stressful moment where the bass melody is already in the key of C minor, using A flat and F, but the accompanying chords are in G minor, F sharp and A natural. This is not enough for Bach. We hear the oboe passage echoed a beat behind in the strings. This has two startling effects, for now the A flat collides directly with the A natural in the violins. At that very same moment, we hear the tail end of the oboe's tonic chord colliding with the string's dominant chord. So if we take a sample of the score, at that moment, the fourth quaver of the bar, we have, reading from bottom to top, the A flat, the dominant chord, and the tonic chord. This is surely the most amazing dissonance to come out of Western music before the 20th century. And it's no accident, as Bach continues to repeat this construction a further 8 times in the movement in slightly varied guises. Here's the whole piece in its spine-chilling magic. In a way, it's a pity that as listeners we can accept something like this so easily, having had experience of the harmonic revolutions of the early 20th century. We must be experiencing a movement such as this in such a different way from its audiences of the 1720s, who must have been appalled, excited, shocked, where we are profoundly moved, perhaps, but without feeling offended by something that seems to shatter unbreakable assumptions. So now, think back to the millennium. If you were around then, you might remember that among other excitements there was a great surge in the performance of J.S. Bach, it then being the 250th anniversary of his death. I wanted to react in some way, so I wrote a piece for the period instrument group that I was playing with at the time, L'Indiscret, baroque flute, baroque violin, bass viol and harpsichord. As I have often done before, I wanted to build my piece from fragments of pre-existing music. I first tried this as a joke in 1967 and somehow it stuck. If this collage of Bach creates a rather agitated surface, this reflects my awareness of his disappointment at the lack of recognition of his art, so far beyond what people at the time are capable of grasping. So the piece is called Quadro Entwurf, with reference to his distressed complaint to his employers at Leipzig of 1736. As a composer, how to start Quadro? With that chord from the first Brandenburg, of course, but out of its context it can lead anywhere, somewhere else altogether. So here is the opening, and if you would like to hear the remaining 9 minutes or so, you can find it under my name on SoundCloud.